Alright. Schönen guten Abend an alle, die schon im Raum sind. Wir warten jetzt noch kurz 15 Sekunden, damit sich die Audiosignale verbinden können und Sie uns auch alle hören. Auch schön, dass wir ein paar Gesichter sehen. Und dann geht es auch gleich schon los. Genau. Wer aus dem Raum fliegt oder uns nachträglich noch joint, der wird von unserer Praktikantin Hanna noch reingelassen. Also keine Sorge, wenn was schief geht, die kommen wieder rein. Dann können wir loslegen. Guten Abend allerseits. Herzlich willkommen zum Transatlantic Tuesday des Karl-Schurz-Hauses. Mein Name ist René Freudenthal aus dem Programm des Deutsch-Amerikanischen Instituts. Ich begleite Sie heute Abend durch Lesung und Gespräch mit Rumaan Alam und seinem Roman Leave the World Behind, auf Deutsch betitelt Inmitten der Nacht und noch druckfrisch erschienen im BTB-Verlag. Sie müssen es spiegelverkehrt erkennen. Ganz kurz zur Technik, ich höre es nämlich schon. Lassen Sie Ihre Mikrofone ausgeschaltet, damit die Audioqualität für alle stabil bleibt. Wenn Sie Fragen haben, können Sie die am Ende noch stellen. Worum es heute Abend geht: Rumaan Alam hat mit Inmitten der Nacht einen echten modernen Klassiker geschrieben, einen genialen Gesellschaftsroman, der sich mit den brennenden Fragen unserer Zeit auseinandersetzt. Mit der Irrationalität unseres Lebensstils, sozialem Status, Rassismus und einer Welt, die aus den Fugen gerät. Der National Book Award-Finalist wird von Netflix mit Julia Roberts und Denzel Washington, I think, verfilmt. Heute spricht der Autor selbst im Rahmen unserer Transatlantic Tuesdays-Reihe mit uns über seine dystopische, aber auch entlarvende Vision von einem Familienurlaub, der schnurstracks in den Weltuntergang führt. Ich sage ganz kurz, worum es in dem Buch geht und stelle Ihnen den Autor noch ganz kurz vor und dann legen wir los. Amanda und Clay, das sind die beiden Protagonisten, die wollen mit ihren beiden Kindern eine Ferienwoche auf Long Island verbringen, in einem gemieteten Haus, ganz imposant. Doch mitten in der Nacht steht plötzlich ein älteres schwarzes Ehepaar vor der Tür und behauptet, dass das ihr Haus sei und auch, dass New York den Strom verloren hat und das Leben an der ganzen Ostküste lahmgelegt sei. Die beiden haben weder Internet noch Handyempfang und wissen also nicht, was sie davon halten sollen. Und von da aus geht es weiter. Rumaan Alam ist 1977 geboren, schreibt für den New Yorker und für The New Republic, war auch schon bei der New York Times. Er unterrichtet an der Columbia University und lebt mit seiner Familie in Brooklyn, New York. So much for the German part, and now I'm delighted to speak to you tonight, Rumaan Alam.
Thank you so much. I love being able to pick out certain words in German. Dystopia. I could hear dystopian. So.
Yeah. That's, you've probably heard that a lot. So before we begin to delve into this summer vacation by the pool, gone very wrong, I have to tell you that I rarely experience physical reactions from reading fiction. So I don't cry either from joy or pain much. I keep a certain distance, I think. But I read the last 50 or so pages of your novel, Leave the World Behind, I've mentioned it already, in an absolute state of alarmed agitation. I couldn't believe it. I had sweaty palms, my heart was quite jumpy, it didn't race, that would have been more alarming, but it was quite something. We will try to keep spoilers to a minimum for audience, that's quite the task as well, but how stressful was writing this novel to this eventual conclusion for you as the creator?
Yeah, it was very stressful, and I'm flattered by your sense that it had this impact on you as a reader. There's again, so it's difficult to talk about without talking about spoilers, but yeah. I think that there are certain primal feelings that are common to the human experience. And one of them is your teeth.
Oh.
That there's something kind of held in the teeth, something very animal, something very primal that connects, all people. And we lose our teeth when we're children, and it's so darling. It's like so sweet. Nothing is cuter than when your kids are missing their front teeth. But there's a lot of anxiety for people, I think, connecting the brain and the mouth. And it's like, it's very common to have bad dreams about like grinding your teeth or missing your teeth. And so when you identify these things, you can press on them as a writer, and they can elicit a certain response in exactly the same way that when you're watching a film and the music begins to do something, it does something to you as the viewer. It preps you for a romantic moment or a frightening moment or whatever it is. Like, and it's like funny to arrive at those sort of subject things that become a pressure point for the reader. But I also had a kind of a similar experience when I was writing the book, and I mentioned teeth, and so there was a specific thing about teeth. And when I was writing that scene, I did this thing that I don't normally do, where I tried to kind of act it out. And so I looked in the mirror and I like touched my tongue to my teeth, and I began to like feel woozy. And I was like, oh, well, so clearly I'm on the right track. Like this is going to elicit a feeling in the reader.
As a person of 20-fold root canal experience, I felt that as the kids say nowadays. This kind of omniscient narrator that's hovering above the action. I mean, there's a third person kind of voice that's very close to basically all of the characters all of the time. It shifts a lot. But I was wondering, I mean, that's not a kind of narration that's that common anymore in fiction. It's become quite rare.
Yeah.
Was that inevitable as a choice to tell this kind of story, or?
Well, that is a really good question, and I do think that it is out of fashion. It's sort of like a 19th century or early 20th century way of storytelling. And in the early drafts of my book, effectively this is a book about 6 people who don't know what's happening. And my first editor said to me, like, it's really annoying. She was like, it's annoying because the reader needs to know, and you have to figure out how to communicate to the reader over the heads of the characters. And she was like, you have to figure that out. And that was really clarifying for me. And I realized thereafter that the book could simply communicate directly to the reader the way that it does in Dickens, or, so many of the sort of foundational Western texts where it's sort of God is telling you the story. And I find that very liberating. It's not the mode of a lot of contemporary novels right now, but I think it's actually really it's a kind of a simple solution for a writer.
So there is this kind of masterfully done tonal shift in the book, just to get the long arch of the whole story. It comes first slowly, this shift, and then in a few punches. I could say loud screeches, but I won't. And I think that's one of the reasons that make the book so potent, because we begin in this kind of upper middle class white people social satire. It's quite light and fun at times, and end in something much closer to ambient horror. And I've already mentioned like this whole core family, basically, this PR person, Amanda, very addicted to her emails, her slightly slouchy husband, an academic, 2 teenage kids, more or less. Although like Rose seemed to me all kinds of ages at the same time. That was a weird experience. Like she seemed to go from 5 to 13 over the course.
She's the baby of the family, so she has access to this babyness. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. And like they are planning for a very relaxed vacation, basically, in this house. They want to jump into the pool, have cookouts, go to the beach occasionally. And I felt, I mean, that's naive to say, but I'm still going to say it. I felt unsure if I was supposed to like or loathe these people, because I wasn't sure in what kind of book I was in at the beginning. And I was wondering, how did your relationship develop to them?
It's funny because I think there is a lot of conversation that I hear among contemporary readers about precisely this, whether you're supposed to like or dislike the people you meet on the page. And I find it so strange because I guess maybe sort of philosophically, it's a bigger question of like whether you're supposed to like or dislike other people generally, and whether other people are likable or dislikable generally. And I think that, to my mind, you're more likely to encounter someone who is unlikable than likable, because people are so complicated, and it's no fun really to write or read about somebody who is a goody two shoes, is sort of perfect and is always moral and doing the right thing. It's much more exciting for me as a reader to spend time with people who are kind of terrible, but not like evil, just sort of, you know,
messy.
Yeah, you get to see them in their full kind of human complexity, which is not always great. I don't think you can, I don't think I could write a book about someone I hated, because you have to spend so much time absorbed in this psyche that you've created. And also you can't help but feel that you're working with the toolkit of your own psyche. That's all you have as a writer. And so then if you hate them, is it just a reflection of your hatred of yourself? So I don't know. I mean, I think they are certainly irritating and complicated in exactly the same way that you could feel about like a coworker in the office who is like irritates you. Like they are meant, I think, to be a little bit, hopefully, real.
Spiky, maybe.
Yeah.
Another character in the book, as is now fashionable to say, I think, is the house itself. And you've been praised a lot, I think, by for your stage setting, basically. And this house is kind of chic but ominous in a way. And like my first hint actually was, I'm from part of Germany in the north where all the houses are built from red brick. And so the information alone that this house is built from red brick but painted white over it so alarmed me, because it just informed me that there was something going on there, and there's things beyond layers. And I was wondering if details such as this modern design that's also slightly ominous and weird because it's so perfect, is that like a modern kind of modern sensibility that you work through to get this kind of feeling grounded in your setting, or you just like?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that anything can be ominous depending on its context, right? So like any place or any sound, like the sound of children singing can be really joyful or it can be really horrifying. Like it's all sort of depends on the context. I like the idea of it being old but covered up and made new, because that seems very American to me. Like to pretend that this old thing is actually a new thing, or to sanitize and cover it up and sort of make it, and I've been in so many homes like that, where it sort of looks old, but you go inside and the floor is like, it's not wood anymore, it's some weird engineered wood. And it goes right up to the edge of the wall. When you go into a place that's actually old, they have an organic feeling because they're made from, they are a legacy of a previous time. And so they've grown and changed and evolved over the years, and they feel more real. There's something strange about this house that it doesn't feel quite real. And like I said, I think it just feels unsettling because you know that it's an unsettling book, in exactly the same way that like the American suburbs can seem really ominous depending on what the text is. Like sometimes they seem really frightening and terrifying. And of course, because this book is sort of connected to the language of horror as I know it from cinema primarily, all of this stuff feels familiar. And I think it feels familiar even if you don't watch a horror movie. Even if you're not that person, you still understand the conventions of that kind of storytelling. And I think that that's why it's effective.
Yeah, I think you don't even have to go to horror movies, because as someone who does ominous suburbia as well as deeply creepy woods, which are also around in your book, is David Lynch. And I kept thinking, because the wood surrounds this house and is also its own kind of character. Also, the children develop a relationship to these woods. And like this sentence from Twin Peaks, the famous TV series, kept going to my mind, the woods are not what they seem, and you should listen to me. Because they didn't. And also because on the subject of woods and nature, animals are not far off. And I'm also trying to say this as unspoilery as possible, but if you read this book, you will never look at a herd of deer or flamingos in the zoo in the same way ever again, I think. And I was wondering where you take this from, this kind of making animals a symbol for something going on in the world, which people don't understand necessarily.
Well, that's a very old idea, isn't it? Like that's sort of like, it's folklore, it's mythology. Like that is every culture since time began has had some relationship to the natural world that they've tried to trace through its relationship to the animal, right? You see it in the cave paintings in France, the depiction of an animal that creates a story that's meaningful to those people. I think one thing that's really important to understand that might be vague to a reader in another country is that the place that I'm writing about is not the wilderness. It's the suburbs. So, you know, like Twin Peaks is a great example. That is the wilderness. That is sort of the edge of the American frontier, you know, up in the Northwest, where the country kind of peters out into the woods. I'm writing about like the suburbs. You know, people live on Long Island and drive into New York City for jobs in an insurance office or whatever. And that, I hope for the reader, holds a kind of comedy. That these people, these urbane people are so afraid of like deer or squirrels or, you know, getting lost on a windy road, but you don't really get lost out there. And that really comes from me. So I have a relationship to this geography. We vacation there as a family in the summertime. And when I was writing my second book in January of 2017, I stayed at my agent's house. She has a beach house there on Long Island. And I stayed there, and there was a freak snowstorm, much like the one that we just had here in New York. And so it snowed like 7 inches. And it was fine because I didn't, you know, and so there's no snowplow to clear the driveway, but I was like, it doesn't matter because I'm staying here and I'm writing. And I was sleeping in the downstairs of this house, beautiful house in the woods. And I was alone in this like big 4-bedroom house, and I had gone to bed one night and I heard footsteps, and I was so afraid, like terrified, and they were right behind my head. And then I was like, what's someone's come to kill me. And then I realized it was just the deer walking around in the woods, and they're quite tame, like they're not afraid of people, so they come right up against the house and they eat the plantings, and you know. And I was so unsettled by it. And then I felt so ridiculous. And I was like, well, I've lived for too long in New York City in this experience of the world that's mitigated by my phone at all times. And I can't, like, I'm afraid of a deer that's like a baby deer. It was really funny. I think it's very funny.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I mean, people get scared easily, I think.
Yeah.
I think because we switched from fake wilderness to urbaneness and what it entails. It would be perfect moment to hear a little passage from the book. And it's actually one of the most famous ones. People talk about it on the internet a lot. And the audience will understand why in a second, I think.
Okay, so I'll just read a little bit. There's nothing you really need to understand about this section except for they've just arrived on their vacation. Amanda volunteered to go to the grocery. They'd passed a store and she retraced that path. She drove slowly, windows down. The store was frigid, brightly lit, wide-aisled. She bought yogurt and blueberries. She bought sliced turkey, whole grain bread, that pebbly mud-colored mustard, and mayonnaise. She bought potato chips and tortilla chips and jarred salsa full of cilantro, even though Archie refused to eat cilantro. She bought organic hot dogs and inexpensive buns and the same ketchup everyone bought. She bought cold, hard lemons and seltzer and Tito's vodka and 2 bottles of $9 red wine. She bought dried spaghetti and salted butter and a head of garlic. She bought thick cut bacon and a 2-pound bag of flour and $12 maple syrup in a faceted glass bottle like a tacky perfume. She bought a pound of ground coffee, so potent she could smell it through the vacuum seal, and size 4 coffee filters made of recycled paper. If you care, she cared. She bought a 3-pack of paper towels and a spray-on sunscreen and aloe because the children had inherited their father's pale skin. She bought those fancy crackers you put out when there were guests, and Ritz crackers, which everyone liked best, and crumbly white cheddar cheese and extra garlicky hummus and an unsliced hard salami, and those carrots that are tumbled around until they're the size of a child's fingers. She bought packages of cookies from Pepperidge Farm and 3 pints of Ben & Jerry's politically virtuous ice cream and a Duncan Hines box mix for a yellow cake and a Duncan Hines tub of chocolate frosting with a red plastic lid because parenthood had taught her that on a vacation's inevitable rainy day, you could while away an hour by baking a boxed cake. She bought 2 tumescent zucchini, a bag of snap peas, a bouquet of curling kale, so green it was almost black. She bought a bottle of olive oil and a box of Entenmann's crumb-topped donuts, a bunch of bananas and a bag of white nectarines, and 2 plastic packages of strawberries, a dozen brown eggs, a plastic box of pre-washed spinach, a plastic container of olives, some heirloom tomatoes wrapped in crinkling cellophane marbled green and shocking orange. She bought 3 pounds of ground beef and 2 packages of hamburger buns, their bottoms dusty with flour, and a jar of locally made pickles. She bought 4 avocados and 3 limes and a sandy bundle of cilantro, even though Archie refused to eat cilantro. It was more than $200, but never mind.
So you have said in another book talk that you think that this scene, this narrative shopping list basically works so well as kind of a literary innovation because it's basically anthropology. And of course, that's what it is. And do you see yourself in a way as this kind of urban, liberal, middle-class anthropologist? Because the book is all set in this house, basically, with a few exceptions. And we get like this very close lens view of this family and their habits and how they see themselves.
And these are the people, these are the groceries that are bought by the people who read novels like this. And so it becomes a way of seeing the self. You know, I don't know if you have them in Germany, but the coffee filters I'm describing is this brand that's called If You Care, which is such a strange brand name. And it's all recycled paper and aluminum products. So they make kitchen foil and wax paper and all of these things, paper towel. And that name, If You Care, is so passive aggressive. Like, yes. If you cared, you would spend $6 to buy these coffee filters instead of $4 to buy the ones that cut down old growth forests and turn them into coffee filters. So the idea that like, if you buy these things, then you are someone who cares and you can say, I care, even though you're also buying package after package made of plastic, full of the things that you're going to eat that will last you a handful of days, which is what we all, well, not all, but most of us do because that's the system that we're trapped inside of. And you can't really, if you want to buy strawberries, they're going to come in this plastic container of strawberries. And so I do think it's funny and I do think it is very telling. And one of my favorite things to do when I do go to the grocery store is to see what other people are buying and see who they are and what their family is like and what their home life is. It's like a very intimate picture of how your family's life works. Yeah,
definitely. I always think about what the lady at the counter is gonna think about when she.
It's very private and somehow, and you know, so I think that I had a lot of fun writing that, and of course that's just my grocery list. When we go grocery, because we go on this holiday, we go to a house usually that we've rented through Airbnb on Long Island. And the first thing I do is I volunteer to go to the store. My husband does most of the driving, so he'll drive us out to wherever we're going. And I'll say, I'll go to the store and I'll go to the store. And this is exactly what I buy.
Well, breaking news. I think this actually leads well into what I want to talk about next, because I think in a fundamental way, this is a book about self-delusional perceptions of safety, of security, of set and systematic order to the world and how we make sense of it. And I think these perceptions get first shaken with this knock on the door on the second night of their stay there. And it's this elderly couple, I've mentioned them in German at the very beginning. And they are the messengers of bad news in a way, which is, they play like a double kind of role in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
They say they are the owners of the house, and Amanda and Clay, who don't have much information outside, they don't have cell phone receptions, they don't have the internet right now, they're not sure. And they're thinking about, could these be like robbers who will kill us? And it's a very fraught situation at the very, very beginning. And I was wondering, this could have gone somewhere somewhere else, let's just say it like that. It could have been a very different novel from here on out. And I was wondering how you were handling these kinds of casual racism questions, class marker questions, because they're done so well. And they're connected to self-delusion, of course, because Amanda and Clay would never think of themselves as racist or as classist. And
well, in exactly the same way that I said, when you read about what they're buying at the grocery store, statistically, it's likely that you recognize that you think, oh, well, I've been that person. I've bought the cilantro, the salsa with cilantro, even though my kid won't eat it. And then so I bought the other, whatever. You recognize yourself in that. Hopefully in this confrontation, the initial confrontation, which is sort of racially charged, you also recognize yourself. And I think it is a complex moment, because Amanda looks at this Black woman and thinks like, oh, well, she must be the maid. This is just a con, which is not a nice or defensible thing to say. At the same time, it's night, it's after dark, they're in a strange place. They do have their children there with them. They're not wrong to be afraid or to be skeptical and to be on their guard. And so it's, it becomes a kind of psychic test of like, well, did you also think that these people are criminals? Because the book is very clear that they are not, And so once you understand that, I hope there's a feeling of discomfort that's not about like whether a crime is taking place, but there's another kind of discomfort for the reader, where you're just sort of like, it's like you're sitting on a lopsided bench or something and you just can't quite get comfortable, which is, I hope, how the whole book works. That even the thing I read about the grocery store, like, it seems fine, like you're just reading about what she's buying at the grocery store, but there's this feeling underneath it of like, something is not right here, something is not right here. And that feeling is borne out by, I think, what the book becomes, which is a book about all of the ways in which the world that we inhabit now is not quite right.
Yeah, definitely. And before we come to that, I wanted to point out this phase in the book where it's basically like a social dynamic roller coaster between these two families, because once it's established that these are the owners and there's no reason to doubt it anymore, everybody has to switch up their roles all the time, because this family still rents the house for a week, but now the owners are there claiming extraordinary circumstances, which also brings a certain something to the dynamic. And is this still a thing, renting a house when the world might be coming to an end? Is Airbnb still going to be there after the apocalypse? And it's so interesting to follow them playing these roles, because also Ruth and George, the Black couple, they have to walk on eggshells to establish their ownership of the house again. And it's like day by day, they try to switch it up. Can I go to this drawer and get this? Can we move from the cellar basically up into the upper rooms? Yeah. It's so interesting. And I was wondering if that comes from a deeper knowledge than anthropology, because we already talked about that, of a deeper knowledge of how feeble the ways we relate to the world and to the people around us are. And
I do think that they, as the Black people in the story, and as Black people in this society, they understand how to perform in order to accomplish their goals, and that they understand that the performance of it's just, that's what dictates their experience of reality. You know, early in the book, I don't know how it was, I don't know German, so I don't know how the translator dealt with this, but it describes him, George, who has knocked on the door, is standing there with his hands kind of up in the air to kind of show, you know, I'm a normal person, like, don't be alarmed. This is a gesture that anyone would recognize, I think. Any culture would recognize this gesture. But in the book, I say it's a gesture that Black men in this country know perfectly, because it's what the police tell you to do. Put your hands up. And when you, in this culture, when Black parents teach their sons and daughters, like, to drive a car, what they teach them is, like, if you are ever pulled over, you sit at the steering wheel like this, and wait for, you don't open you just sit and wait like this. And it is an extraordinary fact, a fact of the existence of, like, a huge percentage of the American population, that they learn, non-negotiably, they learn how to perform in order to survive in this society. And I think that is what you see, I hope that is what you see them doing inside of this book.
Yeah, I think that's something that, I mean, it's not the same situation in Europe or in Germany, but I think that translates quite well, actually, to racial dynamics. So to make a jump into what's happening, and we are walking on eggshells as well to not spoil anything, because I still want to read this book. I was thinking about everything, of course, is a metaphor for everything these days. So people might be surprised to learn that I mean, it's actually astonishing. I couldn't believe it when I read it first, that you wrote this book in 2019 before the pandemic, because it's such I mean, it's people trapped in a house by uncertain circumstances. They don't have all the information. It's like the last 2 years, basically.
Yeah.
It could also be like a metaphor for climate change, of course, and this big bad breakthrough we're waiting for. And now that people might be reading it after this event, we have 150,000 Russian troops on the border of a Central European country. And it might also be kind of a metaphor for a new Cold War, which could turn hot faster than we think, of course, because we want to think we're safe, but maybe we're not. And where did this whole mood in 2019, back when the world was good and Donald Trump was president, come from? And
well, you mentioned self-delusion, so that's like that's the perfect example of a self-delusion. I do think that maybe I thought of the climate a lot when I was writing this book, and so that's been a fact that we all have known about for a long time. But I also, I don't disagree. It's very strange that I would publish a book about people who are trapped and don't know anything into a climate, into a reality where most of us felt a little bit trapped in our homes and we didn't know enough, right? So it's just very odd how specifically that seems to echo reality. But I also think what your question really reveals is something about the function of art, that, like, when we don't understand, or this is the point of art, beyond pleasure, beyond entertainment, like, we need something to explain reality to us, and we turn to art, which is why in this country, and I'm sure in Germany too, everybody was talking about Orwell when Trump was president, right? So we were looking at this document from a previous cultural reality, right? That Orwell was writing about an indictment of, like, an entirely different political system that suddenly felt relevant again. And we needed it, and people, like, looked at it and really engaged with it. And among my friends here, at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were first locking down, although in this country we don't have any discipline, so we didn't really lock down the way that all the Europeans did. So many people I know said, oh, I should read The Magic Mountain,
Mm.
which, I mean, everybody should read The Magic Mountain. It's the greatest novel ever written. But it's so interesting to me that like it was the desire to see like for the book to become a tool to understand this moment. And I think that's extraordinary. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. And so I think, well, again, I can't deny that there's just a weird, in the specifics of what my book is about, it is weirdly relevant. But I also think it was just published into a moment where people were like, I need something to hold on to that explains something to me. And, you know, a lot of books, through no fault of their own, might have felt irrelevant in that cultural moment just because you couldn't get your head around what they were talking about because everything was so odd.
Talking about crutches with people making sense of the world with them. Basically, almost the whole book takes place in this quiet countryside, and what's not there anymore is this constant noise of modernity. So there's no TV, there's no cable news, no streaming services, no radio, no YouTube, no podcasts. It's suddenly gone. First, it's just reception, and then we understand that there's something more dark going on. And I think it's so unsettling that Amanda and Clay cannot get breaking news pushes on their phones anymore. It's so unsettling, and it's so silly that it's so unsettling. And it really makes you understand how dependent we are on these things to make us feel connected to the world, and also to get this addictive kind of illusion of understanding the world, I think. And so I was wondering if you did like a month-long smartphone detox to get
wow. I don't have I don't have the discipline for that, you know. And you know, so in this country, I'm sure in Germany too, like when we learn history in 9th grade or whatever, we are taught that like when the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, that was the beginning of the First World War. That was the act that began the First World War. But nobody understood that in, you know, the day after it happened.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the breaking news that we see of the day on our phones, this is what's happened in the Ukraine, this is what's happened here, this is what's happened there, it doesn't actually tell us anything, but we believe that it does. And I still think we have a moral responsibility to know what is happening, to know that like, this has happened in Haiti, this has happened here, we have to care about that. But I don't think we can handle it. I don't think our minds don't know what to do with it. And so then I think as a consequence, what happens is that everything seems unreal.
Yeah.
So you're hearing about Kanye West in exactly the same way you're hearing about Kiev. And they both become meaningless to you because you don't understand your own personal responsibility to either of those facts. And you don't know what to do with them. And so then we're simultaneously like a deeply informed populace and a deeply apathetic populace because it's just too much information and I don't know what to make of it. That's how I feel anyway.
I think it could be called the Twitter condition as well.
Yeah.
Well, so after so much eerie quiet, because the smartphones are no longer working and the TV just shows a blue screen, comes, and I won't spoil anything with that, I think, a great sound and fury. I'm borrowing this from Faulkner, obviously, pompously. And from there on out, that's like the big thing in the book. After that, everything falls to pieces. I mean, read the book, jacket people. It's not going to be pretty in the end. And very late in the book, and I really perked up when I read that, you hint of a kind of subliminal expectation of the adult characters that something fundamental would happen eventually, that they were kind of waiting for it. They just didn't know it in a way. And I was wondering if this lurking and growing suspicion as like kind of a dominating collective emotion, is that something that connects to the last maybe 5 or 7 years, or does it go way back for you? I know you've connected the book to 9/11 as well.
Yeah, I think it's probably older because I think it's probably a human impulse. You know, I think that there were people who thought like, you know, the invention of the typewriter would be the death of literature, right? So I think that it's like, there is a kind of fatalism baked into the human condition, or like the modern condition, where everyone feels like it's the end of time at all times. It's the end of everything. And what's so striking, I think, in this moment, and I think about like Greta Thunberg and like the activism around the climate of like a very specific generation that's like sort of 2 generations removed from me, right? Like she's a young person, and basically is able to say to like the political leadership in your country and in this country, which is geriatric, you don't have any sense of the future because you are old. You don't care about the future in the same way as you do when you're 17 or 18. And I think that's correct. I think that's really true. I think it's a really salient point. And so this kind of fatalism that they're waiting for something, the other shoe to drop, so to speak, is, you know, it's kind of cynical, and it's not a great way to think about the world, that it's just going to happen to you, as opposed to being a consequence of your own decisions and actions.
Yeah, that actually is the perfect bridge to what I wanted to ask you next. But I also wanted to encourage people, if you have questions for the very end, which is approaching, type them into the chat, and I will read out 1 or 2 at the end if you have any. Maybe I've questioned you out, but we'll see. So the presence of these people's children, of young people in the book, Archie and Rose are the kids, I wanted to give them names, demonstrates kind of this deeply problematic nature of this old sentiment that our children should have it better than us. I don't know if that's a saying in English as well, it's very present in German. I mean, that hasn't been the case economically for at least a generation, and the book, and I think the world, hints at that it's gonna get worse in other respects as well. You yourself have 2 sons with your partner, and of course the book poses this question about an author who is a father, and I mean, everybody who follows you on Twitter knows that you're hilarious kids and are very much a father. I was wondering if it wasn't terrifying to go into this zone where you imagine a future that's even worse than what we've come to expect now. Beyond your own life.
Yeah, of course it's terrifying, you know, but it still feels like a moral responsibility to acknowledge that this is how it is. You know, that like, that in, you know, when the president of this country and the chancellor of Germany were children, there was such a thing as the black rhino walking around Africa. And that doesn't exist anymore. And that is a direct consequence of like the actions of the states that those people now run. Like, and you have to simply look at that and say, like, that's just how it is. And pretending otherwise doesn't do you any favors. And even if you're not talking about sort of like the climate, even just materially, you know, my parents are immigrants, and the great promise of immigration into the West was that you would establish this thing and your children would inherit this thing. And what we've seen in so many, like in my generation, but also really the previous generation, is like the inheritors of this great thing. And you know, that you could have gone from Nigeria to London and become more English than the English, had the best education, become a physician, made £1 million, like really thrived in this other culture. I don't know if that same promise pertains now. And it's a strange thing to think about. I mean, and I sort of rejected that because I am the child of a physician, and I became a writer. And so it's like, I turned my back on that. You know, my role in that was really to become a doctor, but I chose not to do that. But it is a strange thing, this idea that like your children won't do better than you did. It feels like a failure. It feels like a failure of the state, not the individual family. I think it's a failure of the state.
Do you think that's hurting America and its understanding of itself even more, because the American dream is still this ongoing myth?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think it's really laid bare the extent to which that American dream is a delusion, but that dream still pertains for so many people, right? And so many people are desperate to get into this country because materially their lives will be so much better and they are able to make something of it, but the game is so much more unfair now. So I think that it's pretty bad, but we've always known it was, a myth, right? I mean, that's what John Cheever was writing about 70 years ago,
And I mean, that's also a consequence of mass communication, that we just know more about what's going on and have to face. I am trying to post this as unspoilery. Once again, it's a leitmotif for now as I can, but the way you begin telling of what's going on in the wider world in this book, which is 95% set in this house, is very cunning and quite innovative, because it's always just a few sentences. It's really not much, but they paint such a stark picture. Like, it's one sentence about what's happening to a woman in the subway in New York, and you have no idea what's going on at this point. It's one of the first glimpses of outside, I think. And you just get this creeping sense of something is much more wrong than I thought when the first big screech, I think I called it, happens. So I was wondering, did you ever think about painting this whole like Baroque painting of doom and gloom, of apocalypse at the very end, or was it always going to be this way then?
No, I mean, I really wanted it to be almost like the alerts you get on your phone.
Oh, okay.
So that you and I could be sitting and having dinner, and I could get an alert that like this person had been reelected in Hungary, or this person had been assassinated in Venezuela. And I could look at it and think like, oh, okay, now I know that this person is now the president of Hungary. That's interesting. Maybe I don't know what to do with that, so I'll just put it aside. That it would just interrupt the experience of the book enough, but also it would communicate something, again, to the reader, not to the characters, because the characters don't have access to what we're talking about. So I think a lot of it came from my phone, and it also came from reading to my children. So reading novels for children, to my children, and the realization that like I'm telling them a story, and sometimes I'll stop and explain what a word means, or explain or remind, like when I read to my 9-year-old, and well, he has an amazing memory. So sometimes I'll stop and I'll be like, well, what happened last time we were reading? And he'll like recap it for me. Like the idea of like interrupting a narrative experience to give us some footing, I feel like it came from that experience of reading to my kid and sort of reminding him like, oh, the last time we read, when we were reading Alice in Wonderland, like this is what was happening. And he'll be like, oh, right, okay, I remember, let's move on. So it's kind of that authority. It's almost parental more than authorial.
And what's so interesting is that these glimpses are, of course, only revealed to the reader and not the people in the novel, actually. And it's still, it's kind of amazing how they fall into deeper states of anxiety and then panic all the time, even though, I mean, nothing is happening to them at this moment. I mean, stuff starts happening late 50 pages, but there's a whole section of the book where you can feel them get so anxious and panicked, and all the social codes break down that have been so painfully worked out between these 6 people. And I mean, no one's dead yet. It's just a phone that's not working anymore. They even have electricity, which New York doesn't anymore. I was wondering, where do you think this gloom comes from?
I think it's all just like, this is something that I say this about Trump in the book, and I think it's true. It's like a lot of society is in agreement between the participants, and all it takes is for one person to violate that agreement, and then nobody knows what to do, because we thought we had an agreement. So we thought that we had agreed that like to be the leader of a nation, you had to be a certain kind of person. and you couldn't be a low and coarse person. Like, we agreed that that was not going to fly, and then it did, and then everyone was like in a panic. There was no there was such a political panic in this country among people who are sort of like sit out of the political sphere, right? Because they didn't know what to do. They were like, well, this is, I'm offended, it violates the norm, you know? So we have to like reclaim the norm by putting on a pink hat and using the word pussy to empower us to correct this violation. And it's like, well, that doesn't do anything either. Like, that's not going to do anything. Like, that is the best you can come up with, but it is the best you can come up with, because once you break the rules, nobody knows what to do anymore. And one of my favorite things that someone has said to me about this book, because the book is very opaque, it's really unclear what's happening. And a reader said to me, I thought that it was all a delusion. I thought they had worked themselves up into this state, and they created something out of nothing. And I love that interpretation, because that is exactly what happens, isn't it? Like, I mean, that would be like an episode of The Twilight Zone or something, but I do think it's what, you know, it's like Lord of the Flies or something, right? Like, I mean, something is happening in Lord of the Flies, but they enact this weird animal savagery for no particular reason, just because it's baked into them as human beings.
I mean,
you know?
Yeah. Now that you say it, I like it. It didn't cross my mind like 20 times, but I thought about Melancholia and Kirsten Dunst in Lars von Trier's movie, where the apocalypse in form of this giant meteor isn't real before it's real, because we think it's just a metaphor again for her depression, and then there actually is a meteor which will destroy the earth. And I mean, that is something that hangs in the balance of your book as well, I think.
Yeah.
Before we get to the last reading and say goodnight, I of course try to busy myself with the apocalypse and its broader definition. And the American journalist Tom Hawken, I don't know if you know him, wrote an essay for Flavor Wire, of which he was editor-in-chief for a time. And it was titled, Not with a Bang, What if the Apocalypse Already Happened and No One Noticed? And in that he says the following. In Greek, the word apocalypse literally means lifting of the veil. And the further we get into the 21st century, the more we see that capitalism is a Potemkin village, not an utopia. We work longer hours than ever. There are no flying cars. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Our democratic process is a sham of polarization and deadlock, dominated by even more ridiculous rhetoric that reflects nothing of how we're actually governed. The machine keeps running. It doesn't look like it will ever stop. We've arrived at this most mundane of dystopias. The world of late capitalism was the end of history, in fact, the end of the world. Are we all living in some sort of global afterlife already? And I should say this is from March 2016, and there were things to come, I think.
Yeah.
So how did you conceive of your own kind of not at all mundane apocalypse for this novel, without saying too much, of course?
Yeah, it's funny. I think what you just read articulates that there is a feeling that's probably more pervasive than we realize or understand, that a lot of things don't make any sense any longer. And that we simply have to put one foot in front of the other, because you can't just sort of stop your life. And that a lot of the bargains of existence don't pertain anymore. And it's very strange, but nobody has the time to stop and do anything. And none of our political leadership have the instinct to address any of the problems. But I think we all sort of know what those problems are. And it's an unsettling thing to be, to all sort of collectively be experiencing this and then sort of saying like, oh, well, what are we supposed to do?
That's a good sentence to end on. And you have prepared a second
yes, and actually it's kind of the perfect thing to read.
Well,
in the light of what we were just describing. So it's very short, but in this in this scene, the children, the teenagers, have wandered into the woods behind the house. In the woods, you had this sense of something you couldn't see no matter how you tried. There were bugs, dun-colored toads holding still, mushrooms in fantastical shapes that seemed accidental, the sweet smell of rot, inexplicable damp. You felt small, like one of many things, and the least important too. Maybe something had happened to them. Maybe something was happening to them. For centuries, there was no language to describe the fact that tumors blossomed inside of lungs, beautiful volunteers like flowering plants that take root in unlikely places. Not knowing what to call it did not change it. Death by drowning as your chest filled with sacks of liquid. Rose felt eyes on her, but then she pretended often that she was being watched. She saw herself at the remove of a cell phone camera. She was young and didn't understand that was how everyone saw themselves, as the main character of a story, rather than one of literal billions, our lungs slowly filling with salt water. In the woods, the light was different. The trees interfered with it. The trees were alive and felt like Tolkien's majestic creatures. The trees were watching and not impartially. The trees knew what was up. The trees talked amongst themselves. They were sensitive to the seismic reverberations of bombs far distant. Trees miles away, where the ocean had begun to breach the land, were dying, though it would take years for them to be reduced to albino logs. The trees had all the time that the rest of us do not. The mangroves could outsmart it, pull up their roots like a Victorian lady's skirts, sip the salt from the ground, so maybe they'd be fine with the alligators and the rats and the roaches and the snakes. Maybe they'd be better off without us. Sometimes suicide is a relief. That was the right noun for what was happening. The sickness in the ground and in the air and in the water was all a clever design. There was a menace in the woods, and Rose could feel it. And another child would have called it God.
Thank you so much. That is actually one of my favorite parts of the book. There are many beautiful invocations there. And I think the one thing that went through my mind when I heard it again now is then it's so terrifying, this passage about having no word for the tumors. And then I thought, well, I guess the God in the Bible did have an idea in his mind when the first job he gave to men was making up names for stuff.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. That's like how we master things, is by giving them language so we can feel better. But maybe it doesn't matter, you know? I
guess, yeah, the tumors don't care. Oh, that's
yeah.
not a good sentence to end on at all. Well, here we are. It cannot end pretty, I guess. With that, I want to first thank our audience for tuning in tonight. You can Leave the World Behind in English, but of course also in German as Inmitten der Nacht. It's actually on our largest local booksellers best-selling list this week. I've checked, so you can get it there or in any other bookshop in town. You can also come to our next literary event on February 24th, where I'll be speaking to Rachel Cusk, the legendary author fiction writer. Yeah, we've been working for years to get her, so don't miss that.
Good one.
And most of all, I want to thank Rumaan Alam for being with us tonight and so generous with his time and words. It was a true pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
And I wish you all a good evening. And thank you for the claps. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.